I've talked before about the set of metaphors that connect our conceptualization of knowledge with our understanding of space. As I've already noted, knowledge is an abstract concept, and according to the precepts of conceptual metaphor theory, cognitive linguistics, that kind of thing, we can't literally apprehend and conceptualize abstract concepts. Therefore, we can only understand abstract concepts, like knowledge, by the application of some kind of metaphor. And just to repeat again, the key metaphor for understanding knowledge and the organization of knowledge is spatial. So we understand facts, knowledge items, as being arrayed in some kind of a space around us. I've already talked about some of the entailments of that, and just on that, again, coming from conceptual metaphor theory, one of the principles of that is that metaphors aren't random and arbitrary in the way that they were traditionally understood to be in the writings of people like Searle, for example, but they are coherent and consistent, and that coherence and consistency comes from the sources of those metaphors being within embodied behavior, embodied actions. So, in the case of space as knowledge metaphor, our experience of space is consistent and coherent. Therefore, the conceptual metaphor that knowledge is space also acquires a kind of consistency and a kind of coherence from that. I think we can see that in the sense that, as I've already talked about, we talked about knowledge which is mainstream and knowledge which is fringe, which is a consistent mapping from the idea that the center of something, near the place where we're standing, is easy to access and easily visible and easily understandable. Mainstream, if you like, central. And knowledge which is fringe is out towards the horizon, difficult to access, easily obscured, possibly occulted by shadows and obstructions. So I think what we're seeing there is a kind of coherence and consistency within that metaphor. Mark Johnson refers to that set of metaphors that come together to make a coherent picture as an image schema. He says these are coherent image schema. And again, I've spoken before about that in relation to schema like the image path, the source path goal schema, for example, and there's many others. So to return to this idea that space is knowledge, we should find coherences and consistencies in addition to the one I've already mentioned to do with mainstream and fringe, center and periphery. One of the ones I'm interested, for example, is the relationship between space and different kinds of sensory access. So objects which exist in space at some distance are only accessed by the sense of vision, whereas objects which are close up can be accessed possibly by vision, but also by our sense of touch. And then items which are extremely up close and personal, perhaps even inside the body, can also be accessed by the sense of taste, perhaps only accessed by the sense of taste. And so that spatial logic, that entailment of how space is, the fact that different spatial distances and proximities allow for different sorts of engagement, different sorts of sensory engagement, we should see that mapped onto different types of knowledge. And I think I've already suggested we do sort of see that. Objects, when we want to describe an object of knowledge which is and we want to say it's objective, we use visual metaphors. When it's up close and we understand it better, we have better access to it, it may also be objective, but we start to use tactile metaphors. We start to talk about being able to grasp this piece of information, for example, or we might be touched by it, or it might be affect us at the level of our feelings. So we have a very intimate, much more intimate relationship to the knowledge because it's perceived as being up close and personal within the range of our grasp. And when some sort of knowledge is extremely up close, to the extent that it's inside of our body, again, there's a mapping across from the spatial logic of sensory engagement. And we talk about it not being objective at all. It's not an object out there in space which is witnessed by other inhabitants of that space, for example. It doesn't have that objectivity. It's located inside of our subject, ourselves as subject, in its subjective knowledge. And then we use gustatory metaphors. We say it's a question of taste. And taste is understood as being individual, personal, almost part of our being, really, part of our personality, part of the givens, if you like, of ourselves. So I think what we're seeing there is an entailment of this image schema to do with space, in which there's a consistency and a coherence relating proximity and distance across the various sensory modes which can come into play depending upon that proximity or distance.